Awesome. So what I've got for you today is kind of a brief 45-minute long introduction to neuromorphic computing. So I've assumed like a basic knowledge of physics and a little bit of eng, but we will sort of step through the basics of computers and see how we go. So essentially what I really want is to make this something that we all get something out of. So if at any point you have a question, please ask your question. It'll give me a break from talking for 45 minutes and we'll probably both learn something. So please, if at any point it's not clear, raise your hand and we'll chat about it. The reason I say this is because I was at a party the other day and someone got me talking about my research topic, which is fairly unusual for parties. I don't know how often you guys get asked about your research topics, but it happened and then I was having a great time explaining neuromorphic computing, and then the person seemed to be really nodding along and engaging. I was like, wow, this person really gets it, they know it. So then I like dived deeper and deeper and deeper, and they looked like they were really enjoying it. And then I found out a few days later that like after the first 3 sentences, nothing at all. So please don't let that happen today. I want this to be something that we actually enjoy. So neuromorphic computing. There's a couple of things that I want to approach today. I want to start off with a basic motivation for why this is actually a field that's worth knowing about, worth potentially researching and just being aware of. I want to then break it down a little bit and look at the differences between von Neumann computers, which is our traditional style of computer, compared to a neuromorphic computer. Then we'll move on to some of the key concepts of neuromorphic computing, things like neurons and synapses and how we actually create those in hardware. We'll have a look at some of the architectures that we're trying to recreate. And then my favorite section will be number 5. We'll actually take a deep dive into a particular architecture for neuromorphic computing. It's called the superconducting optoelectronic neuromorphic network. It's very exciting, don't let the name scare you. And then finally, we'll have a look at how we actually recreate synapses, which is the way that I did it in my honours research, which is something called an optical interconnect, so a light-based interconnect. Make sense? Everyone's raring to go, I can see. Wonderful, we'll make a start then. So if we talk about motivation, it's all about energy efficiency. That's one of the biggest reasons, hey Michael, that we're interested in this field. So hands up if you know what ChatGPT is. Yeah, I'm like watching you, you've got to put your hand up. Everyone knows what it is, right? AI chatbot, a lot of people are using it, kind of like a search engine, but it's being very heavily used, especially in the last few years. Oh, let me just change something real quick here. Ruben, can I get your help? Can you put it on speaker view so I can see my notes? Thank you. So how many of you have actually come across neuromorphic computing before? Has anyone? Yeah, you have. You have. What kind of context? Like, where did it come up? In sensors? Sure. Yep. Like in software, like neural networks and such. Ah. Fantastic. All right, wonderful. We'll talk about that soon, actually. What were you going to say? Sorry? Ah, as in creating the artificial brains? Yeah, awesome. Will, were you as well?
Yeah. Just talk about a lot of things like
yeah. Yeah, exactly. No, this is right down the avenue of biomimicry. Awesome. And you've probably heard me talking about it at lunchtimes as well, so you can't avoid it. Okay, now that I can see exactly what I have to talk about, let's keep going. So ChatGPT, the reason that I bring it up is because it's very commonly used, but it draws an insane amount of energy. To sort of explain what that is, it uses about 40 million kilowatt hours per day, which is equivalent to the amount of energy that everyone in their households uses in Brisbane, 2.5 times that amount every day. So it's a lot of energy. There was another description which was like 1,000 US households in an entire year will use the same amount of energy that ChatGPT uses in a day. Right now, that in itself might seem like a lot, but when you consider that ChatGPT has so many alternatives, what we're seeing is a huge draw of power in this kind of area of modern computing. I think statistically, it was the 117 lowest energy consumption countries, all of them put together use less energy than ChatGPT does annually. So a lot of energy is being taken up by this kind of software. Modern computing in general, in terms of global energy consumption currently, or at least in the last few years, was sitting at about 10% of our global energy consumption. But in 2030, it's supposed to rise to 21% in a best case scenario. That's a lot of growth in just a couple of years. And in the worst case scenario, I think it's getting up to like 51%. That is a huge amount of the energy that we're using every year. And it's a problem. It's a problem for obvious reasons relating to global warming and climate change. But as I'm sure you know, any kind of energy production really impacts the environment. And that's largely because I think 80% of our energy production comes from fossil fuels, and our use and our actual gathering of those sources results in pollution and results in greenhouse gases. So the more energy that we're using through things like ChatGPT and all sorts of modern computing are using more and more of those fossil fuels for energy, and that's really ramping up the effects on climate change and global warming. So obviously this is something that we want to avoid for multiple different reasons. And to address this, there's two main things that we can do in this area. The first thing that we can do is sort of swap to renewables, right? That's obviously the first thing, but that's not happening as fast as we are requiring power consumption. So the other option in this area is to decrease the amount of energy that we're actually using. And modern computing is a really great place to focus, because now we're having a look at how we can create computers and systems that in general, use a lot less energy. So essentially, the basis of this is that technology, since the Industrial Revolution, is what's gotten us into this issue. So we're going to need some smart tech to get out of it. And that's where this idea of neuromorphic technology comes in. So the reason that we've gone for this, as Wilbur kind of mentioned, is this idea of biomimicry. So we've taken inspiration from the most energy efficient computing system in the world. Does anyone know what it is? It's Wilbur, he pointed to himself. What is it? Yeah, it's the human brain specifically. The human brain is about 1,000 times more energy efficient than our most state-of-the-art computers that we've ever created. Neuromorphic computing is particularly interesting, and this will be discussed in the architecture that I talk about later. But the architecture is actually 10 times more efficient than the human brain, at least in theoretics. So not only can we significantly reduce the impact that modern computing is having on climate change and global warming through energy consumption, but we can actually create something that's going to be far better than our brains are, which is really exciting. Of course, this is the theoretical stage. It's beginning to be implemented. You've probably heard of a number of companies like Intel creating their own neuromorphic chips, but this is becoming a really popular area of research across most universities that you'll go to. So I'm very excited to be able to introduce it to you today. So in summary for that section, why is it important? We need to reduce our energy consumption. Is anyone not convinced of that at this point? I'll take that as a unanimous, yes, we've got that point. Wonderful. It's also great for improving computing performance, especially when used with artificial intelligence software. That's largely because the software works in a fundamentally different way to the hardware that we're trying to run it on. We'll discuss that soon, but that's one of the reasons why we're looking towards neuromorphic computing. And also, the area that I find the most interesting is that this really can be a model and a test bed for neuroscience. There's so much that we don't understand about the human brain, and it's really hard to study it if you're just simulating it on a computer. The amount of energy that's required for that and the processing power is insane if you're trying to get something on the scale of a human brain. So if we could actually create this in hardware, that would be a much better way for us to start exploring further the brain. So what actually is neuromorphic computing? Let's get onto that. Essentially, it is mimicking the structures of the human brain in a way that allows us to process information. So we're trying to recreate in hardware neurons. So for example, on the left, you have an actual neuron. I believe that's imaged from a human brain. Could be another brain. And then this is a particular implementation of what a neuron might look like if we created it in hardware. There are so many different ways in which we can do this, so we'll talk about a couple today, but this is the main aim of the field. We're trying to recreate structures that we find in the brain and recreate the way that the brain processes information and put that into a computer hardware. So basically, we're looking at something that is really energy efficient. It's very high performance for computing, especially for artificial intelligence. And interestingly enough, people are also talking about it as it says here, the building block towards artificial and super intelligence. So this structure of computer kind of allows us to create artificial brains. We can take that to whatever extreme we want. So some people look at this field as a real abstraction. So they don't look at a neuron as literally recreating the neuron structure that we saw before. They look at it as a node that processes information in some way, whereas some teams are looking literally to recreate the function of the neuron exactly as. So we can take it towards an artificial brain as much as we would like. To discuss a little bit better why it's good for AI, and comp sci people, this will probably be nothing new to you, but for the rest of you, this is kind of an infographic for neural networks. So neural networks are a type of artificial intelligence that's run in software, so this is not in hardware. And the basic idea is that you have these neuron nodes. So you have the input layer in which information, actually I can just point at it. Can you guys see that? Cool. So information is inputted here. It might be, for example, a picture of a dog. So you know when you open up your camera app on your phone and you search through the gallery, you can search for particular things. Unless you have a flip phone, you're probably familiar with this. Wonderful. So you can input an image, for example, or a bunch of images into the neural network. It's going to filter that through these layers, right? I'll talk about that in a moment. And it's going to output essentially a yes or no answer as to whether or not this is the dog, depending on how this network has been trained. Now, it's called a hidden layer because we don't generally know exactly how it works. We input a lot of data, we train it, and then it kind of sorts itself out. Of course, there are lots of different versions of the way in which AI does this. This is the basic kind of idea. Now, what we're looking to do in neuromorphic computing is to recreate this in hardware. So we're literally building neuron circuits. We're creating them with some type of artificial synapse, and then we're setting a bunch of these layers to learn from the information that we give it. So there's two kind of approaches. We can literally create it in hardware and have it exact, so we've designed it for a specific purpose, or we can allow it to learn and change its actual hardware, which is quite an exciting field. We'll talk about that soon. Essentially, that was the section for motivation and a short introduction. Any questions yet? Any points of discussion? Any signs of life in the room? Michael?
Yeah, call back to where they talk about how much energy is that because of the process of the actual listener, or is it because of the number of
all the generative training that I had to go through?
Yeah, actually, that's what about. Is it the training that causes so much energy? Is it the number of people who are using it, or is it the actual process itself being slow?
I think it's a mix of things. I'm not exactly sure of the specifics. I'm not a ChatGPT engineer, but I think they take those averages and they bring it out of all the generative training that they had to do, so how they trained it to be able to respond to language input, but it's also how much it actually costs to query, to take those queries and search and understand it. Yeah.
But the main thing you're saying is probably the training.
Yeah, the training is the really energy intensive period, but there's definitely a consumption that's used every day as well. I think these are actually the details of the day. I would assume they probably have some of the averages from the training, but I'm not 100% sure. Yeah. The main takeaway from that is that it uses a lot of energy and it's becoming more and more common. So we have to deal with it. Does that make sense? Cool. Any other points of discussion? Wonderful. All right, we'll keep going. So I wanted in this next section to talk about how neuromorphic computing is different to von Neumann computing. So who's familiar with von Neumann computing? Oh, you guys are going to know this better than me. This is fantastic. So von Neumann is the traditional style of computer that we're using at the moment versus neuromorphic, which is something, oh, I forgot I put this in there. I think you can tell which team I'm on. So I wanted to firstly discuss where neuromorphic computing actually came from. So it was a field that was really popular theoretically in the 1980s and 1990s, and it came out of Caltech from two people called Carver Mead and Misha Mahawalt, and they released a paper which was called A Silicon Model for Early Visual Processing. And essentially what they created, sorry, I keep kicking this thing underneath me. Essentially what they had created was a retina, so the sensing part of the very back of your eye. They'd artificially recreated that in analog form on a silicon chip. So it was the very first time that we'd sort of recreated a part of the human body in that way outside of the body. You're looking suspicious over there, am I wrong?
No, I'm not suspicious. I'm like, it's just a cool thing to like comprehend in the mind.
Yeah.
Like, how do you artificially make something and then identify that it's like?
Yeah, well, the paper's still out there. So it's 1980s, so like some of the graphics, as you can see from this, are different to what we find today, but they actually walk through exactly how they've done it. They've created, and we will talk about this a little bit later, but circuits that respond to light in different ways and then can differentiate it to visualize images. So they not only made a retina, but they then went forward and they also made a cochlea, so part of the sensing part of your ear. They made neurons and they made synapses. So this is way back in the 80s, all on silicon chips. And what people realized is that perhaps they could start to apply this to computing. But unfortunately, nothing really happened at the time other than these very sort of basic analog versions, because we had a fundamental limitation on the kind of technology that we could use to create these. It was really difficult to do back then. Since then, with the advent of things like electron beam lithography, which is a fabrication technique, I'll talk about it later, we're actually able to get resolution down to the nanometer scale, so a couple of thousandths the width of a hair. So we're actually really able to create these at a size that rivals regular computer chips. So that's why this field has really taken off in, say, the last 10 years or so, become a really exciting place to work. So the question is, I guess, why did we apply this to computing? What was the point of taking things that we see in the brain and then putting them into the computer other than the energy efficiency side? Don't we have everything that we already need in our computers? And it's a fair question. So let's talk a little bit more about von Neumann computing. So this is a very, very basic description, essentially, of a von Neumann computer. The important things to notice here is that the central processing unit, so the CPU, here is in a different location to the memory. Now that might not seem like a big deal, but when you're doing lots and lots of different calculations, every time you do a calculation, pretty much you're going to need to import memory from somewhere. So the memory is going to go across here and it's going to be bussed across the other section. A computation is going to occur, it's going to be bussed back, right? And so you get all of this movement to and fro, and that becomes a real bottleneck, a real limitation in how much processing and how much power you can actually get out of these kinds of devices. So that's one of the biggest issues that we find with von Neumann computers that we're reaching at the moment. It's what's called the von Neumann bottleneck. Has anyone come across it before? Yeah, wonderful. So I want to quickly run us through what a traditional computer actually looks like and what it's made out of. So comp sci people, again, this is first year for you, but for everyone else, I found this particularly useful. So essentially your basic building block, like a neuron is in the brain, is your transistor and your transistor pairs. So we can use the transistors and put them together in various combinations to create these things called logic gates, which allow us to actually do computations on the data that we've got. From there on, we can write programs to actually run the electrical computation, but yeah, we can skip that part and we can run programs that actually use a bunch of logic gates on a larger scale and follow the instructions to actually do something useful. So if I break it down, this is the basic structure of a transistor. I was going to go into the physics of this. Am I allowed to, Ruben? Does anyone want the physics explanation of how transistors work? Yay, thank you so much. Okay, wonderful, because most of this is like computer sciencey type things, and I'm like, please let me out the physics. So the exciting things about this, do you guys know about n-doped and p-doped regions? Wilbur does. Yeah, anyone in material science as well will know this kind of thing. So essentially what transistors are made of, or this particular form of transistor, it's on a silicon substrate. So you've got silicon, which is itself something called a semiconductor. And what you do is you take that block of silicon and you shoot different atoms at it to what we call dope it with something else. So some really common ones are gallium and arsenic, I think, from memory. It's been a while since I've studied this topic. So if we shoot, for example, gallium atoms at a specific region of silicon, we can actually replace some of those silicon atoms with the gallium, and we can do the same with the arsenic. And what that does, is it changes the sort of composition of electrons in the area. So nothing actually changes in terms of the charge when we put gallium atoms in. But gallium, I think from memory, do you guys remember, gallium's got less electrons. It's lower on the periodic table than silicon. Is that right? And arsenic's the other way around? Okay, so the other way around. I'm gonna talk about it generally. So when we put the gallium in there, suddenly, oh yeah, because that's the p-doped part, isn't it? Okay, well, we'll talk about that as a very sort of basic introduction. But if we've got the gallium in there, what we suddenly have is something called a hole. So where you'd expect there to be a certain number of valence atoms for your silicon, suddenly there are less. Now the charge distribution in that area hasn't actually changed because the protons are equal to the electrons in the gallium atom. But when you're thinking that it's just cilium, suddenly you've got silicon, you've got these areas of holes. Now when we do it with the arsenic, we can create another area where suddenly we've got more electrons than we would expect. And so we see at the boundaries of these regions that the electrons from the n-doped area, the negative area, actually fill the holes of the p-doped area, just at the boundary. So we end up with this region that is slightly negatively charged just here. Now, because a current is also electrically negatively charged, it doesn't want to flow through here if it's got any other option. So you create this device essentially that can control the flow of electricity, and that's the basics of a transistor. And the way you actually control how electricity goes through this is that you take this conductor here, so you have an insulating layer here and then a conductor, and by changing the electric field of the conductor, you actually can push through the current or allow it to run through, or you can stop it. So essentially a transistor has two states. You've got high voltage, so lots flowing through, that's state 1, and then you've got a lower voltage version, which is state 0. Regardless of which state you're in, it's always pulling energy, and that's something that's important to remember when we compare it to neuromorphic computers. So yes, that's the basic function of a transistor, and you always have them in pairs, is my understanding. By the way, does anyone know about the transistors that they've been creating at UNSW? No? So obviously these transistors are made of many, many atoms, but there's a team at UNSW which is making transistors out of single atoms. That's like, just one atom is an entire transistor. So we're really seeing some exciting work. I think Max might know that it's something to do, I can't tell if it's with the states of it, like the spin of the atom or not. I'm not sure if they're verging into the quantum to do that. But my understanding was that it can be used with classical computers. Do you know? No, sorry, I'm picking on you and you didn't realize I'm doing that because he's a physics major as well. Okay, so do we all understand the basics? Yeah, Michael? Say that once more for me.
Why is it the enriched? Makes it that
not quite. It's the boundary here. So the extra electrons, you know, the fact that we have the holes from the gallium in this section and then the extra electrons from the arsenic in this section. So they can flow towards the holes part and fill the holes, but obviously only just at the real edges, because otherwise they're not going to sense that that's there. And so because you've suddenly got a bunch of electrons that are at the edges, you've got a negative charge, right? Because originally they were balanced in terms of protons and electrons, but now you've got an influx from somewhere else. So you have this negative region just here. So any charge that wants to come through comes up against that negative charge. Does that make sense? Okay, you can tell me at the end of this section. Has anyone else got any questions? Please, if you do, let me know. Okay, wonderful. So that's the basis of a transistor. With transistors, we can put them together to form these things called logic gates. Now, logic gates were the bane of my 4th year quantum courses because we did quantum information science. You know what I'm talking about, right? So I'll just introduce you to a very basic one. So essentially what they do is they take the information in binaries. So in a transistor, of course, I mentioned we have 2 states. We have 1 and 0. So lots of current going through, not so much current going through, is my basic understanding of it. So that stores information. Now we can represent any number in the real world as a binary number, as a combination of 1s and 0s, but put in specific places. So the location of them relative to each other is important to represent that. And then we can take that information and we can pass it through these logic gates to do computations on it. And that's the very basics of how a computer works. So this is an inverter. Very simply, it takes the output and then it turns it into the opposite state. So if we input a 0 state into it, what's going to come out? Yeah, thank you. A 1 state. So we put a 0 into it, we're going to get a 1 state out, so it's inverted the state. And if we put a 1 state into it, what will we get? 0. Wonderful. Please talk with me, guys. I require the feedback. So yes, essentially we can create lots of different types of logic gates. This is a very simple version of that. And this forms the basics of how we can do computations in computers. So this is an integrated circuit. It's a place in a computer where you tend to find a lot of logic gates. And what happens is that when we do computations, we pass electrical currents through these logic gates, and this changes the state of them, and that's how we actually perform computations. And again, when I mentioned the von Neumann computers have CPUs and memory separate, every time we're doing that, we're probably going to have to transfer it to some kind of memory to store that result. So that takes a lot of time. Finally, if we keep pulling this up and we connect this to some kind of input device, which allows us to give instructions to the computer, we can use these networks of logic gates to actually perform things. So we build up the fundamentals, and eventually we're going to end up with something like an app or visual systems. I'm going to leave that to the computer scientists because that whole region of study terrifies me greatly. But that is the basic of how a von Neumann computer works. Does that make sense? Wonderful. Okay, now who's heard of Moore's law? Yeah, you know everything. Every time I ask, this person knows. Wonderful. Yes, so Moore's law it's not actually a law. It's a little bit confusing, the title. It's a trend that was noticed by a guy called Moore, that every year, or was it every 2 years? I think it was every 2 years they ended up changing it to. The number of transistors in a computer chip was able to double because of better technology and better fabrication of these devices. So that held from sometime in the 1900s. Does anyone know when that sort of started? A long time ago, many decades. And that held all the way up until about 2013. Right, now that was a fantastic trend because chips were able to essentially, at a basic understanding, work faster and were more capable of computation. So that was great for the whole industry. However, it started to slow. I think my understanding that the reason for that is because we're starting to reach actually the quantum limit. So we're getting things so close together that we're experiencing quantum tunneling effects and such, which obviously is not great for the output of your computer. So we have this issue where we've had great progress for many, many years, and now all of a sudden it's stopping. And that's terrifying to anyone who's invested money in this field. So people are really having a look for what they can do to solve this and looking to other areas of computation as a means for doing so. So if I recap with von Neumann computing, the two main issues that we have other than energy consumption when it's used with things like artificial intelligence is the von Neumann bottleneck, where we have to bus information between our computational area and our memory area, and then also Moore's law and the fact that it's slowing and we're sort of stopping seeing as much advancement as we were. Yeah, so to compare between this and neuromorphic computing, before we actually get into describing what a neuromorphic network is, I wanted to touch on some of the points where these are different. So one of the first ones is this idea of parallel processing. So in a CPU, my understanding is that it only performs one task at a time. Now you can get dual processing cores, which are able to do more than that, two, in fact. But it's very different to a neuromorphic computer. So essentially, if you have free neurons in a neuromorphic computer, you can use them for different things. They can be doing multiple tasks simultaneously, just as your brain can do. So as long as you've got that free neural real estate, you can keep doing different things. Program dependency. So obviously to get a von Neumann computer to do anything, it needs to rely on programs that you've written. And I've got a note here that says, if your instructions aren't right, you're kaput. So essentially, you really want to make sure that you're giving it the right instructions. It's very dependent on that. Neuromorphic computers, on the other hand, are actually dependent on the neural structure. So the way that they're all connected together and the way that they're weighted. This is interesting because it can either be built, hardwired in, or hard-coded, that's the word that you guys use, isn't it? I remember. Hard-coded in, or you can actually create it in such a way that the computer is able to change in hardware. So there are some really interesting areas looking at this, not just in terms of the current that we're sending through different areas, but actual materials that we're able to change the structure of using electricity and light. So I'll talk a little bit more about those, but they're called phase change materials, and they're very exciting for this area. Another area in which they're different is how they encode information. So, Michael?
You would like things to be changing positively, right? Is there a way to actually encourage positive change over negative change when it comes to self-changing?
Yeah, exactly. So I imagine that they probably can encounter a little bit of both. It depends on the optimization method that you're using to train it. So I'm not exactly sure about how they go about training this. I'm more trying to just build it so someone can go and train it afterwards. But yeah, I imagine you could do both ways. It all depends on what your actual aim is for it as to what that's going to look like. But yes, theoretically, you could train it to be worse at its job if you wanted to. Depends on how badly you train it. Yeah. So thank you. That was actually quite an interesting question to think about. So in terms of information encoding, the differences lie in von Neumann being about binary information, so ones and zeros, whereas neuromorphic encodes information in neuron spikes and also the timing of those spikes. If we go into efficiency very quickly, obviously the von Neumann computers have this bottleneck that's really stopping them from progressing a lot further. Whereas neuromorphic computing doesn't have the bottleneck. We're generally processing and storing information in the same area, which is really exciting. Also, as I mentioned, with the transistors, they're constantly drawing energy. Even when they're not like zero state, they're still using energy. Whereas when you get to neuromorphic computing, they actually do not draw any power when they're not being used. So in the quiescent state, they're not drawing power. They only draw power when you're getting neurons spiking. So that's one of the reasons why they're really energy efficient. We'll talk about how that actually works soon. And finally, scalability. So neuromorphic computing is exciting because you can really scale up these systems. So if, for example, you added another neuromorphic chip, you're not simply doubling the computation power, you're not adding it, you're actually combining the two chips because they're actually able to make more connections. So that's another avenue for computation. They don't just act as separate CPUs. So that's exciting, they combine their power. Awesome. So that was a brief introduction to the differences between neuromorphic and von Neumann before we actually talk the nitty-gritty about neuromorphic. Any questions on that? Any thoughts that were interesting? Any discussions? Signs of life again. We're still awake. Wonderful. Okay, well, we'll move on. Let's talk about the key concepts. Does anyone want to have a guess as to what those would be? What are our key building blocks for a computer that works like a brain? Yep. Synapses, yeah, that's one of them. And there's one more that I'm looking for. Starts with an N, it rhymes in neuron. It's a neuron, yeah, exactly. So these are our basic building blocks. Instead of transistors and logic gates, this is what we're trying to recreate instead. Again, there's lots of different levels of what this is going to look like, different abstractions, and whether or not it's really similar to a brain or not. So if we talk about how a neuron actually works, how many of you have got sort of a neuroscience background or really? Oh my gosh, oh, wonderful. Okay, we can go quite fast through this. So obviously you would know that neurons communicate when they fire. Right, now that firing event is called an action potential. The way that it works is that you have a bunch of other neurons that are up here potentially. And one of those neurons, when they fire, they release neurotransmitters into the synapse between them. Now those neurotransmitters may, hopefully, join onto the dendrites. So there are receptors on the dendrites here. And if enough of those join, what you see is a change in the electrical potential inside of the neuron. So if enough neurotransmitters actually activate the receptors here, what you're going to get is an internal electrical potential change, which is what we call the action potential. So that potential is going to travel all the way down the axon until it gets to terminals, and then they are going to release neurotransmitters again, which are going to go to more neurons, which is going to continue on and on and on. Are we all familiar with that process or understand the basics of it? Wonderful. So the important thing here is that we need enough neurotransmitters, we need enough activation to actually reach a certain threshold before this neuron will fire. So this is the basis for what we call a spiking neural network. That's what most neuromorphic computers are based off of. Yeah, so if we talk about numbers, how many of these are actually in the brain? The average brain has 86 billion neurons and 100 trillion connections. Obviously, the average physicist brain has more than the average engineering brain. Just checking you guys are still awake. Obviously not true. Maybe. Sorry? Lower again. Sorry. No, I'm kidding. And the interesting thing to know, though, is this is obviously, it's an average, right? So when we look at neurons, they all have different numbers of connections. So certain types of neurons will have maybe 2 or 3 connections. Other ones can have, I think it's 200,000. That's wild. But the average they take is about 7,000 connections per neuron. Now that's something that obviously we need to recreate if we want to reach the level of efficiency of the brain. That's really hard to do in hardware. Like, it's taken so many years of evolution to get to this point. I think we're really lucky that we have something so amazing to try and copy. But it's very difficult to do, and we'll talk about how we actually do that soon. But essentially, as we talked about, the aim is to create neurons in hardware. We want to replicate those brain components. Now, there are many different components to the brain that we might try to replicate, but essentially we want to choose our focus areas to work on. And the basics of that is we're choosing neurons and synapses. It's generally an open question as to whether or not this is the best thing to do. You know, this is a totally new endeavor in science. We don't really know what we're doing. I mean, that's what research is anyway, right? So it's an open question. And again, as I keep mentioning, that idea of the level of abstraction to whether we literally recreate a neuron and what it does, or we sort of take it as an example, that's also an open question. So people are doing all kinds of different things there. Now, I snuck this in because I just personally think it's really interesting. Is anyone familiar with how you fabricate computer chips in any kind of nanoscale device? A little bit? Ah, wonderful. Something I can finally teach you guys that you don't know. So a lot of the fabrication in this field, and the reason that it's grown so much recently, is because of this thing called electron beam lithography. So this is a very basic kind of diagram of how this happens. Essentially, you start off with a substrate. So in this case, generally it's going to be silicon. You'll start off with a big wafer. So you've got a lot of room in which to do this, and after that you'll break it up into computer chips. But essentially what you do is you put something called a resist on top of it. Now that resist is sensitive to beams of electrons. So when we fire a beam of electrons at it, the structure of that resist is going to change in a way that'll be important for the next step. And at this point, we also use our computers to design what the pattern we want on that chip is actually going to be. So we load it into an electron beam lithography machine, and there's actually some literally just over there. So the lab in which a lot of this is done is just under Hawken. So break in, have fun. No, please don't do that. It's impossible anyway. But I feel like I'm thinking about this way too long, and as I'm saying it, I'm realizing it's recorded. So I'd like everything scratched from the record. Thank you very much. Yes, so we load our information into the electron beam lithography machines, and that tells them where to put these electrons on our chip. So we beam those electrons down, and we're able to do that with real resolution because of the tiny size of the electrons and how advanced these machines have become. So that changes the structure just here and just here. And when we, in the next step, apply, actually skipped a step here, we apply an etching process. So essentially we add corrosive chemicals to this, and they eat away at the material at the top of the metals. These are actually terrifying chemicals. They are like, they don't hurt if they get on you, but like a few days later, they'll just start to eat through your skin, and there's nothing you'll be able to do about it. It's very scary. So you wear a lot of protective gear when you're in actually doing this stuff. But essentially you etch away so that the regions that have been touched by the electron beam are gone. So now you end up with a resist here, and then a little region that's not protected by that resist. Then we go through this process again. So there's multiple ways in which you can do it, but I'll just describe the one I understand more, and that is etching. So again, we apply a very corrosive material once more. That's going to eat away at all the layers that are not protected by that resist. The last step then is to etch it again with something else that's going to remove that resist entirely. So you end up with funny shapes. Now that might not seem like a lot, but the really interesting thing here is that is nanometer scale. It is tiny. You'd never be able to see that with your eyes. It's really impressive that we're able to carve this out of something so minuscule. So you can keep repeating that process, and then once you've got your holes, for example here, you can then apply different materials. Maybe you want to put an insulator in there for some reason, and you build these up in different layers until you have your computer chip or lots of other devices that you can make. Does that make sense? Wonderful, cool. So that's how we actually go about making these devices. Oh, I forgot that I put these in there. So this is what you wear, essentially. This is me in the lab, and I was excited because this is my first training, I think. I'm not doing anything exciting, I'm just cleaning a chip. But anyway, it looks cool. And that was part of my Instagram story, I think. Obviously, such a cool person. Wonderful. And that was me learning about the theory for all of this very late the night before I had to go into the lab. So there are a number of questions that we need to consider before we go into actually making these devices. So what are the other brain functions that we want to mimic? So obviously there's not just one type of neuron or one type of synapse essentially in the brain. What if we want to create different charges inside the neurons, different resting potentials? How do we do that? We also want to ask, how do we change the weighting of the synapses and the neurons itself? So that's going to affect how much those neurons then stimulate neurons downstream from them. How do we actually influence the threshold at which neurons will fire? How do we recreate that in hardware? How do we allow neurons to influence themselves? Can we create ones that are inhibitory as well as excitatory? And finally, how do we get the system to learn? So how do we get it to change itself and learn based on what we're actually trying to get it to do? Oh, there's another one. What materials do we use? And that's sort of the topic for my PhD. This is something that we'll get to at the end if we have time. But the question is, what do we do to recreate the neurotransmitters? What do we use to allow communication? And there's a lot of discussion now which is going on. Do we use electricity, as we've done in all computers pretty much so far, or do we skip along to the photonic side of things and start to use light to communicate? So we'll talk about that soon, and we'll talk about it in the example architecture as well. How are we going for time, Ruben? Still got time? Okay, wonderful. So I mentioned this just before, but any questions from the last section, by the way? Michael, yep. You're a fiend for these questions, aren't you? In the electron beam lithography?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That was for the node, right?
It's for anything.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I'm not too sure thought of. I was going to ask, how does that help illustrate neurons?
Yes, we're going to talk about it. So that essentially is the basic tools that we can use to fabricate. That's just a basic introduction to it. We'll get onto what a neuron actually looks like pretty soon. I promise we will get there. I'll go faster through this because I want pizza as well. Cool. So I mentioned this briefly, but there's a lot of different ways in which we can design these. There's so much potential. So there's conversations that are going on now is, do we use electricity to communicate between these neurons? Do we use electricity within these neurons to make them run? Or do we use light instead? Do we use an optoelectronic system in which we combine both of them? Or do we use something else entirely, right? They're all open questions in this field, and you'll find a group who is doing literally anything. Like, I don't think anything's really being ruled out at the moment. So there's lots of different examples that we can use. There's also lots of benefits and negatives to each of these. So it is kind of a question of suiting it to your activities. So our aim with neuromorphic computing and with spiking neural networks is to imitate the brain, right? We want neurons to fire when they get enough input from upstream neurons. The information we're going to encode not just in the spikes of those neurons when they go off, but also in the timing. So that's an integral part of the brain, is that we're using both sides of those to encode the information. The interesting thing about that, and we'll get on to this, I feel like I'm being vague at the moment, but that time information, so the times and the series at which neurons fire in response to some kind of stimulus, it's emergent. It depends on the specific subject. When you've got von Neumann computing, it's got a clock that allows you to do each step. So this is a significant difference as well. It's what we call event-driven computation. So the actual timing of the event carries meaning. I'm just going to skip through this and give you an example. Has anyone seen Grumpy Cat in like a year or two? I haven't. I thought this was exciting. Let's step through an example of how the brain actually processes this so that we can look at how we would do this in a computer. So you have all just seen the Grumpy Cat. I assume that you've all recognized that that is in fact a cat, not just a cat, but the Grumpy Cat. So that's quite an impressive computation that you've all done very quickly, and I might add on very little energy consumption. Such a nerd for this stuff. So how does it actually work? So you see Grumpy Cat, light from the screen is reflected into your eyes. They travel through your eyes, through a number of layers of cells, and they hit the retina at the back. Now the retina cells translate the wavelengths of light and information about the direction from which they're coming into electrical signals, and they then pass these up through the octave nerve, through the thalamus, and up into the visual cortex in the occipital lobe of the brain, so right at the back here. Now, the visual cortex, I think, is one of the best studied regions of the brains. We know quite a lot about it, though, again, as with everything in the brain, we really don't know that much in terms of things. So I think in the next sections I've got about this, but the visual cortex has a whole bunch of areas. They're called very creatively visual area 1, visual area 2. Do you know what the next one is? That's coming. So V1, V2, V3, V4, V5. And each of these processes information in a different way. So we start at V1, and V1 processes very kind of basic visual information. Even though it's basic, it's actually combined into well, it's actually not combined, it's in different layers. So all of these different layers, there's 6 within the V1, and then there's more within each of the others. They all process different information, different neurons, different connections. So when the cat goes into V1, and the first layer of V1 is looking at very simple visual components, so things like orientation and direction of that image. So it responds to horizontal or vertical lines on the cat. It's going to help you work out the edges, so you're going to be able to identify things like ears and whatnot. That information is then sent to layer 2, and it integrates it further into a more sophisticated way. So now we're starting to look at color, we're looking at spatial frequency, we're looking at moderately complex patterns, and object orientation. So we're now processing the cat in a slightly more abstract way. And this gets passed on and on and on through V1, and then again through those other layers before we actually sort of recognize what that is. Now, interestingly enough, in the brain, we do have some specialized neurons. You guys might have heard a little bit about these, but some neurons, if there are objects that are particularly important to us and also objects that we see regularly, we can actually end up with a neuron that's devoted to recognizing that exact thing. You're smiling. I think you might know what the next slide is. So there was a study done, I don't know how long ago, and Heath knows as well. There was a man who was found to have a neuron which responded only to pictures of Jennifer Aniston. This man had an entire neuron devoted to Jennifer Aniston, right? So it's actually not unusual. We probably all have neurons, maybe not for Jennifer Aniston unless we're like huge Friends fans or something, but neurons that do respond to specific objects. So if you really like cats, maybe you have a specific neuron for cats, maybe even for grumpy cats specifically. I don't know if that's better or worse than having a Jennifer Aniston neuron. But yes, that's one way in which your brain can recognize what the subject material is, or your brain will recognize it out of a pattern of neuron spiking and the timing of those patterns. So that's how the information is encoded and recognized. How do we do this in a computer? Great question. We're trying in a very basic way to replicate that structure. So we have the input, like this might be our retina. Then we've got our multiple hidden layers, hello, which is going to be where the rest of that computation takes place. And eventually we'll have some kind of output like, is it or is it not Jennifer Aniston? So yes, that's the basis of how we're going to try and create a computer, or what we're going to try and get it to do. Why did I have another a slide here? Oh, this was just to say that timing is important. I feel like I already emphasized that point, right? The timing of when these spikes occur is also where information is encoded, not just the fact that the neuron has spiked. So again, I mentioned there is a difference of opinion on how much we want to directly replicate this. Do we want it abstract? Do we want it to be exactly like a neuron? So has anyone heard of the Loihi chip? So this was created by Intel. It's one of the first neuromorphic chips on the market. Again, it's fully electrical, so they haven't really entered the photonic side of this yet, but they've gone for a much more abstracted version. I think the reason they wanted to do this is because they still wanted to use a lot of the circuitry from traditional von Neumann computers. Obviously, if you chuck that out, you're going to have a lot more work to do. So they're like somewhere in between. The stuff that I was working on for my honors that I'll talk about soon, that was a lot more about literally replicating the brain. Cool. Everything makes sense so far? We've come a long way. We're nearly there. This next section is the bit that I was really excited about, and probably the nugget that you're actually here for. This is how we actually create a neuromorphic computer from the circuitry up. So this is just one particular example of neuromorphic architecture. There are so many out there. There's so many different ways. Everyone's approaching this differently. So this is just one particular example. So the paper that this is based off is called Superconducting Optoelectronic Circuits for Neuromorphic Computing. It came out of NIST in the US, so the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It was a very influential paper and has sparked a number of experimental teams trying to recreate it, including the one that I was with my honors. That was the quantum technology group or lab in physics at UQ. So this beautiful thing, this is the basic neuron that's proposed by this architecture. So I want to talk you through all the different parts of this. So essentially, this is an electrical circuit. Up here, we have an input current from somewhere. This is what we call the bias current, and we're going to be able to use that to influence different things about how this neuron works. Now, you have two options if you are the current on which side of this you're going to go through. You can go here through the left, or you can go down through the right and continue on your way through the network. On the left here, does anyone know what that symbol is for? No. So that's a superconductor. So these specifically are superconducting nanowire detectors. I'll explain how they detect in a moment, but essentially if a superconductor is being run at very low temperatures, so cryogenic temperatures, it's about 120 Kelvin and below. I don't remember what that is in Celsius, but cold. It's going to be superconducting. So electricity can run through it without actually using or encountering any resistance. So you've got no loss of energy there as you go through, which is one of the reasons these systems are really energy efficient. When it's in state zero, right, when it's quiescent, it's just running through the side and nothing is happening. Now, the reason that these can work as detectors is because they can pick up photons. If you imagine that you've got, can you see my like green over there? Yeah, there. Imagine you've got other neurons and the neurons communicate using light. Or say, for example, this is like a neuron in your retina. one of the retinal cells. Light comes in and it is incident, so it hits the nanowires. Now, when it hits a superconductor, it causes a local increase in temperature. Now that's important because if you increase the temperature of a superconductor enough, you increase it to above its critical temperature, it stops superconducting, right? So it becomes resistive just like any normal wire would. So if enough photons are to hit this detector, what happens is that the current stops flowing on this side and instead it goes down the other side. Now, does anyone recognize this symbol? It's a bit more familiar perhaps. Yeah, it's a diode. So essentially it's a device that turns electrical currents into an output light. So the basic structure of this neuron is that electricity comes through. If enough light is incident upon it, it's going to change the flow of electricity so that it goes to the diode and it emits more light. Now that light itself can then be sent further on to other neurons to activate them. That's the basics of it. Does that make sense? Michael?
Isn't that electromagnetic?
Don't be mean, don't make me get into this, but yes, it is. There's a lot of detail in terms of actually photons hitting this area. There's a lot more in the paper if you're interested to read it. I won't go, I don't think we have time here, but photons actually hitting it is a probabilistic event, so it won't necessarily happen every time. But they've taken that into account in the design of it. So you can use it in like a few photon regime, and the really low power ones will do that where there's only, I don't know if they detect, I think they can detect single photons, but obviously you probably need more than just one photon to make this work. But you can also run it with more photons, so you're more likely to have them actually be incident upon the wire. Is that okay for you? You'll allow it. Wonderful. That's very kind of you. So yes, this is the basic structure of that neuron. Any questions on it from anyone else? Yeah. You're asking questions that are close to my heart. Thank you. Yeah, so there's actually a number of different areas. So the nanowire, I think we already have quite a lot of good superconducting materials that we can use for this. So Max, you're related to superconductors, right? Oh man, sorry. Sorry? Ah, you study this as well, do you? Oh, with Arcady? I didn't know you were with Arcady. Yeah. Yeah, wonderful. So you guys, have you talked to Andrew's group about this? Yeah, it'd be interesting if you guys do, because I assume they're after taking suggestions about what materials you use. For my PhD, I'm not exactly sure. The group's done a lot on phase change materials that I mentioned earlier, so probably not the superconducting stuff. But that would be a fascinating area. So I'm a little bit jealous that you're getting to do that for your research. Are you a PhD student? You finished already? Oh, nice. You can relax slightly more then. Cool. Any other questions on this? So basic structure of the neuron. Obviously, we probably want to be able to create more complicated neurons on this. This is the very basic area. And we also probably want to be able to change the weighting of these. So how do we actually change, for example, the sensitivity of these neurons to firing? And one thing we can do is we can change the number of nanowire detectors. So if you have, and by the way, this is something that has to be done in construction. This is not something that can be learned like later by the system. There are ways that you can make it more sensitive by changing the bias current, for example. But this has actually got to be done beforehand in hardware. You've got to know that you want sensitivity on certain neurons, which can make it slightly problematic to implement. So essentially what you do is you've increased the number of nanowires. You actually make it less sensitive to incoming photons, right? Because if you've got more channels through which the electricity can flow before it stops being superconducting, then you have to have more and more photons incident on it before it actually converts it over to the diode, right? So say, for example, over here, you're seeing that there is a neuron incident here, a photon. It'd be terrifying if there are neurons flying at it. Photons hit here, but we can still have current going through these other ones. So you need photons on all of them. You need them all to heat up to above that critical temperature before the diode goes off. So that's one way in which you can change the sensitivity. The other thing you can do is you can change the bias current that's running through here. So the other important thing about superconductors is not only is there a critical temperature, but there's a critical current as well. So if you run a certain amount of current through it, it's going to become resistive. So if you want to make it more sensitive, you can increase the current that's already running through it. So you need less photons actually to hit it before it becomes resistive. Does So that's one way to make it more sensitive or less sensitive. And the current is good because it's something that you could probably change in the running of the computer. So that's a way in which it can probably learn. So as I mentioned, we probably want to create more complicated neurons. The one I showed you before essentially is just a step function, right? It's on or it's off, but in reality, what we see in a neuron is more of a, what's the word? Sigmoidal function, right? So if we want to recreate more what the brain is doing, we need to look at different types of circuits. So here's an example. This is a series nanowire detector. So this is a little bit different in that the number of photons will actually increase the current going through to the other side, right? Because you're increasing it closer and closer towards the critical current or the critical temperature that it's going to start feeding through the other side. So that's a way we can start to get the sigmoidal approach, having them in series rather than in parallel. Because if you're in the parallel case, right, the electricity can just continue to go through the other superconducting wires, where in this one it doesn't have that opportunity to. So it starts to go through the other side at a different time. We can also create inhibitory neurons. So these are quite common in the brain, neurons that don't just excite downstream neurons, that actually inhibit or suppress the firing of those neurons. So this is done by the upper circuit up here. So essentially, the current that's coming down into the lower circuit, by the way, this is just an amplifier. It allows us to kind of decouple the two sides of that for various applications, but for the idea here, you can ignore it. So essentially, the bias current that's coming down to run that, we can change it using this circuit up here. So as photons are incident on this wire and it becomes resistive, less current actually goes through to this circuit down here. So the more photons that hit this guy up here, the less is going through here, and so the harder it's going to be for that neuron to fire, right? Because it's further away from that critical current. Yeah, oh, this is another version as well where you can still have this one outputting. So this is a fully functioning neuron itself. It's still outputting light because it's got one of those diodes, but at the same time it's inhibiting or suppressing a different neuron. You can also make this in a self-feedback loop. So we have a lot of these in the brain as well. If your neuron is firing a lot, it'll actually inhibit itself to suppress that firing. And the way in which that works is that as the diode emits light when this neuron is firing, we tap some of that power and we actually send it up here to another detector, another resistive nanowire. And as that becomes more resistive, less current goes through to this guy. So it makes it harder for it to fire. So it's only going to fire if there are suddenly a lot of photons present, like a really strong stimulation. We can also, as the green arrow shows, we can tap that and send it to other neurons. So upstream from that neuron, we can actually start to suppress those as well, which is something that we want to borrow from the brain. So as a kind of summary, if we want to change the sensitivity or the weighting of those neurons, we can change the current. Again, that'll help us change sensitivity, so that threshold at which it fires. We can change the diode settings as well to potentially actually send more light out. And yeah, this is a way in which you can change the activation thresholds. Now, this is sort of a culmination of what that could look like. This is a recreation using this particular neuron architecture or neuromorphic architecture of a visual cortex. And SON, by the way, is just superconducting optoelectronic neuromorphic network. That's the abbreviation for it. So this is a model in hardware that would allow us to study the visual system of the brain. So essentially, the retina that we talked about before for our grumpy cat, if we imagine the grumpy cat's going through this, different colored light is getting picked up by different nanowire sensors. So if we put a filter in front of it, we can have just certain amounts of light, certain wavelengths of light hitting it or not. So that allows us to pick up different colors. So detecting different wavelengths of light, just like the cones in your eyes are doing. So again, once those colors are detected, the signals are integrated and they're sent through to the thalamus region, which is just here. Now, the N stands for a neuron circuit and the S is a synapse. Now, this is probably less than you would actually have, depending on how sophisticated you want to make this visual device. Yeah, but essentially, the signals are then integrated from there further and further, and it's abstracted more and more and more. As to what all of these individual neurons do, we don't necessarily know. If you're familiar with the way artificial intelligence neural networks are trained, we have layers in the middle where we don't exactly know what the individual neurons are doing, what their actual function is. But we know that the output is right because we've trained it. So that is potentially what could happen here. We don't know exactly what's happening at these neurons, but we can test whether or not we're getting the right output. Yeah, so you have in this not just the basic neurons, but also inhibitory and excitatory ones, especially as we're going through these layers as well. So essentially what we can see is those very basic units of the neurons, we can actually build up into something quite complicated. Now, synapses is another question, and hopefully we actually have time to look at this at all. How are we going for time?
We'll probably go get some pieces now when we get back.
All right, so I've got until the pizza smell arrives into the room is what I'm hearing. Okay, well, are they from Pizza Cafe? Okay, so I probably have like 10 more minutes. Can you guys stand 10 more minutes of this? Wonderful. Okay, I'll release you, Ruben. Goodbye. So synapses. This is the synapse that is actually put forward in this paper, and I have to say it's really messy. This is quite a difficult, if you were an experimental physicist that's going to actually try and recreate this, this is what a theoretician has forced onto us. There are better ways in which we can do this. But essentially, it's made up of a whole bunch of waveguides. Just put your hand up if you're familiar with a waveguide. Yeah, vaguely a little bit. That's okay. So a waveguide is, you can think of it as kind of like a tunnel. It's a material. It's not actually necessarily hollow, but it's a channel through which light can propagate inside a material. So the refractive index is such that it stays within a certain channel. So think of it as like a wire. Electricity goes through a wire, light goes through a waveguide. So all of these lines here are essentially waveguides. And what's happening is that light from different neurons, so these are all connected to other neurons, is being combined into a whole bunch of strands. So you've got lots of merging of these waveguides into finally a single sort of input over here. And this is what one of those nanowire detectors might actually look like, so that we really have a maximum chance of having the photons actually hitting it. So Michael, as you were saying with the probabilistic thing, this is kind of how this architecture is looking at it. You're sending the light round and round and round and round and round. So you've got lots of opportunity for it to actually hit the detector. So I guess that's kind of how they're trying to combat that. But yes, this is very difficult to actually make. There's a lot of loss every time that you actually, not only do waveguides incur loss as the light propagates, so it's absorbed into the material eventually, but also when you try to merge them together and change direction, you also incur a lot of loss. And not only that, but it's very hard to fabricate those kind of merging in a way that's efficient. So essentially, this is difficult to make, and it's also not particularly effective or efficient. So my honours project was, how can we make this better? Is there any way in which we can make it more robust to error, we can make it easier to fabricate and more efficient for those synapses between the neurons? So we'll go there in a moment, but does anyone have any questions on the last bit that we talked about? Yeah. I'll just go to you first and then I'll come back to you. Yeah. In this particular paper, great question. In this particular paper, they just put forward like a very basic synapse. They're not one of the groups that was like literally recreating the brain function, but I'm sure that there are groups who are looking at different synapses. And I think it's actually a really good idea because you might get different functionality, right? And if you're using the same thing for everything, that's not going to be optimal. So yeah, in this case, we're just looking at like basically how do you take a signal from here, light in this case from here, over to here in the most simple way possible. But yeah, I think there's a lot more opportunity for sophistication there. Great question. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, this is the main issue with using superconductors as the detectors. That would be so. Can you make a room temperature superconductor for me? Please. That'll make this so much more efficient. But yeah, you bring up a really good point in that is something that's not energy efficient. If you look at its use with artificial intelligence, I think it probably will still be more effective if we had equal systems, but we still needed to cool it. Probably still going to use up less energy than a traditional like von Neumann computer. But yeah, it's definitely not as efficient as it could be. So there are also versions of this that aren't at superconducting temperatures, don't use superconductors as their detectors as well. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So there's I don't know if that particular is used at a group. It might be. Otherwise, you could start one. Yeah, exactly. No, there are different groups who are looking at different ways of doing that, including phase change materials. So yeah, there's lots of different ways in which we can approach that problem. This is just one particular implementation. Cool. Any other questions? And then I'll... No? Yep. Yeah. Wonderful question, and it actually lead into the next section I was going to talk about. So we'll see how much of this we can actually get through before pizza. There's quite a lot here. I don't expect we'll get through it all, but we'll get through the basics. Actually, I'm going to skip through to what it actually looks like. So this was kind of a discussion on where the synapse is. I think we've covered enough of that. One thing we have to decide, though, is when we're actually creating the synapses, do we use electricity or do we use light? Now, one of the main reasons to go for light is because as we're making these devices smaller and smaller, electrical currents have an issue called crosstalk, where if you have electrical currents running close together in conducting materials, sometimes you can actually generate a current from the electric field of another one in a different wire. So that's like another synapse just currently, or another neuron just activated randomly because you have another neuron nearby. It's obviously not going to be optimal for running your computer. So that's a problem that we have with electricity, but it's not one that we have with light. Light's good because it doesn't have crosstalk. It also is much faster to propagate, and we can actually encode information in the light in a way that we can't with electricity. So we can encode it in the frequency or the wavelength, in the shape of the light, and in a whole bunch of other things like intensity, for example. So what do we actually make it look like? This was a brief discussion, or is, I suppose it hasn't actually happened yet, I've just practiced it, of what the design process is for these neurons. So if we imagine the most basic neuron format, which is one neuron here, sends a signal to two neurons over here, right? That's what we call a beam splitter in photonics or optical physics. And the traditional way of designing these is just like trial and error, really. So you might think, okay, if I'm going to create this, maybe I'll use waveguides and I'll just split them like that. And then you might fabricate it, use all the electron beam lithography, fabricate it, test it, and find, oh, actually, that wasn't very efficient. So why don't I slightly change this here so that it's less sharp? Maybe we'll have less loss. So you change it a little bit, you design it, you fabricate it, you test it, and then you find something again. So it's a very difficult method to use because there's a lot of time involved with designing and fabricating. It's kind of, you don't exactly know where the optimum is. You'll follow a channel, but you never quite know if you're going to the optimum design. And there's generally a lot of loss. So it's not the best way in which we can do this. But what we can do is sort of turn this into a matrix equation. So if we imagine, here we are, that the input light can be described as a vector, the output light also a vector, and the transformation between the two as a transformation matrix, then we can turn this into a matrix equation. If we rearrange the equation, we can try to solve for this. Of course, we can't solve it exactly, but we can use things like gradient-based descent optimization as a way to solve for the best possible matrix. So we have this equation, and we set what's called an objective function. By the way, guys, this is it's a thing called inverse design. So where we swap it around and we search actually for the transformation rather than trying to change the transformation and look at the output that we get. We go straight to the source. So we rearrange the equation, we solve for that one. Yeah, and essentially what that looks like here is this is our interconnect. So here's the light coming in, going out, and within that interconnect, down to the resolution that we can make in an electron beam lithography machine. So I don't know, maybe that's like 2 nanometers or something. I think it's down to like a nanometer at this point. So you have 1 nanometer size pixels in the area that you want to create your interconnect. And we can actually optimize this, so solve for what the best values of refractive index are, and we can transfer those to materials. So what the best material is and where it should be placed. And the way it works, I'll show you in another slide. Yeah, this is kind of what happens throughout that. So as the machine optimizes, it changes the location of different elements. So in this simulation, what I'd done is I'd said, okay, you are made of silicon, but you can also have pockets of air. So the purple in here is air and the yellow is silicon. And the computer, using an inverse design program, will go through and kind of work out the best possible placement so that light coming in here will hit those pockets of air. It will scatter. That's something light can do that electricity can't do, which is another benefit. And it will scatter off to all these different outputs, right? It will go off to different neurons. So essentially what that looks like is we do it with electron beam lithography. Again, we can encode pockets of air in different places using that etching technique. And we can see what it looks like. This is another example of a wave-guided one, essentially to say that this is a very complicated and difficult way, and if we use things like inverse design to create a scattering box instead of a whole bunch of waveguides, it's going to be much easier to make, much less prone to error, both in fabrication and usage, and it's also going to be a lot more efficient, has less error in it, because every time these waveguides split or they cross over one another, they lose intensity. So if I skip through that and get through to the interesting things. Yeah, so look, there's loss, it's difficult to fabricate. Yeah. So this is back to that waveguide. This is what it actually looks like. I feel like I was skipping through because I started talking about this early, and I want you guys to see what this actually looks like. So pay attention to this one first. This is what our computer simulation has showed us as the best possible design for where we can put the air so that light coming in here is split into these two waveguides. So that's how we can take, as your question earlier, we can take light from one side and decide on the directions to send it to those new neurons or the downstream neurons. This is a simulation of the electric field, right, of the light as it goes through. So essentially you can think of that as the path of the light. So we see that it's really intense here when we're sending it in. So that neuron, the diode, is emitting light when it's activated. And as it hits the air, it's starting to move here. So the air scatters, we have constructive, destructive interference of the light, and eventually we get it going off into these two different channels. Michael? Yes, so you have to specify exactly the frequency that you're doing this, otherwise this optimal design will look different, right? Obviously, as light of different wavelengths hits the air, it's going to react in different ways. Now, the reason that we put air in there, by the way, that's just a random choice. You could put other materials as well. It's because it has a different refractive index to silicon. So it's going to bend the light in a different way, and that's how we create its scattering effect. Does that make sense? Any questions so far on how we're using this to move the light? Michael? Yep.
When you're done with the splitting, will you then regain a coherent light or will you lose coherence?
I actually don't know. I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. I think it'll all be coherent actually, because you're not like changing anything about the light, you're just slightly changing its direction. Yeah, I guess it depends on whether or not you can get it back into the same. So I think what this is doing here is probably putting it into the same direction. So I think you'll have maybe part of it's that's coherent. You could probably optimize this so that you do get coherent light out, but it depends on whether or not that's actually important. So in terms of our nanowire detector, you don't necessarily need coherent light for it to just hit the detector.
And if you're using a split in series, and then you have coherent light here of this frequency, but you turn off.
You mean if you put like a frequency filter over? So yeah, we can actually filter it out. We can make sure we know what the frequency is, but this process won't change the frequency of the light. It's just going to change the direction of the light traveling. Yeah, so it'll still be all of the same frequency. So I think it should be fine.
Then another question was, with keeping the light coherent, with that cost, like, is that expensive?
I'm actually not sure. Look, you're probably going to have to do a bit more in your simulations if you want to make sure that it's still coherent. But that'll all be done in the design phase. So if you're willing to spend a bit more time and add a little bit more code into whatever creates this, then I don't think it should be much more expensive. No. Oh, if you want to actually create it, I'm not sure. I have to say, this is not my area of expertise. I don't know, but it's an interesting question because you may be able to build in functionality that uses that. But at this point, it isn't important to this particular architecture. Yeah, interesting question. Yeah, so this is what this looks like in a basic beam splitter, so a 1 to 2 neuron. Yeah, I think I explained that already, but the yellow is silicon, purple is air. This is having a look at how well it's split between it. So it's actually, it's not great. If you did more simulation on this, you might make it better or you changed it slightly. It's 5% less efficient in transmission than a lot of the things that we find in literature for waveguide-based things. However, it's 40 times more compact, and that's really important. So you might be willing to let go of a little bit of efficiency for that, or you might just want to work harder to try and make it more efficient. And you could do that potentially with material choice by increasing the size of that. So you give it constraints as to the size of the synapse that you want to produce. All of those things can be changed to make it more efficient as you would like. It just depends on how much time and how much code you want to write, really. This is all results from my honours degree, by the way. So we also looked at 1 to 6 interconnects and different sort of shapes of these neurons just to have a play around. Not exhaustive at all. Actually, we just like tried 2 different versions. Again, if you have light coming off here, it's going to depend where your other neurons are. So that might be fine if you've got neurons that are like located down here. But the other option is you might end up having to have a waveguide that then like turns it back around. So you might incur a little bit of loss, but these are 2 different shapes in which you can do that. And I think, yeah, this is what the electric field, so the light actually looks like as it propagates through those materials. So the general concept of this, or the general thing is, it's called a scattering box. It's kind of the idea that you let light loose and then just scatter it into the next section. So it's one way in which you could do this. There are benefits of it over using a waveguide-based approach. We then looked at 1 to 10s, which was something that we were recreating because it was shown in a theoretical paper how well you could do this as 1 to 10s with waveguides. So we were comparing this, obviously, to the waveguide approach using a scattering box instead. So yeah, again, that's our random pattern of air and silicon that's been created. And this is how the light looks like as it goes through. So I'll just skip to the basis of it. The interconnects that we created were 50,000 times smaller than the waveguide versions, which is a real increase in compactness. Again, that is comparing to a 10 to 100 interconnect. So essentially you want to put 10 of these 1 to 10 interconnects together to get equivalent, but clearly still a lot smaller, which is useful if you're trying to create a lot of neurons in one place. So I think that's the end of it. But essentially that, I hope, answers your question as to how we take light between the neurons. This is just one simple way of doing it. Essentially, the point of my honours degree was to see, firstly, is inverse design that technique of that matrix equation and using optimization to solve for the transformation, and essentially turning that transformation into the actual interconnect device. Was it viable? Was it a good method? And also, are scattering boxes a potential viable route to create synapses? Again, there's so many open questions in this field because it's so new, we don't really know. So it's very exciting to be involved with actually testing all of that out and then sort of changing the direction which your group is traveling. So that was the research that I did. That was the presentation. I've done it before the pizza, which is quite good. So yes, I hope you've all enjoyed. And if you have any questions, gang, you got any questions? Please ask. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Sorry. No, I didn't get to fabricate them, actually. I ran out of time before the end of my honours. So I think the PhD student who's kind of like followed on from that got to fabricate them. So I was quite sad about that, actually. I got to go in and like learn and practice on some other things, but I didn't get to actually make my own chips. So yeah, one day in my PhD, I'll get to do it. Yeah. Any other questions? Has this made anyone interested in actually the field of neuromorphic computing? Yes? Oh, okay, wonderful. My aim has been achieved. I'll go for Isabel and then I'll come back up to you.
I wondered like if you had any thoughts of like, I know like other labs like in Australia, I know like there's cortical labs if you're like growing like little organoids too.
Oh my god, these things are so weird. Yeah.
Yeah, and I wonder like if you had an opinion on, you know, the place of neuromorphic computing versus actually like and trying to replicate the hardware versus actually just using the biological components.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
It's a very interesting question, actually. So for context, what is it? It's an organoid, right? Is that what it's called, or is it an organelle? Yeah, so there are these, you can probably give more detail because I forgot what the name was. I was thinking about it as I was driving here. But essentially there's a number of research groups which have like clumps of brains, essentially clumps of neurons and brain tissue that they're using for experimentation. So you actually have neurons available to you in that. Honestly, it's just a question of which one you'd rather use. I mean, you could use this brain material to make a computer, but we can be, I hate to say it, but we can make things that are better than the brain, right? We can make things that are smaller, more energy efficient, potentially use less energy, though again, that's going to depend on how well we can take the theory into the hardware. There's probably also some ethical questions about like using a clump of brain and saying you are now a computer. That's all you get to be. So my thoughts on it, I do feel like kind of weird of using like brain material. I do think it's a very interesting field of study. I feel like it's probably going to be better for actually testing the way in which the brain works. So obviously this can be used as a test bed for neuroscience theory, but we're never going to exactly replicate what a neuron does. I mean, we can get arbitrarily close, right? But it's not a neuron. It's not made of the same things. So I think those kind of organoids are really good for testing what's actually happening. And maybe if we could recreate, say, example, the visual system in that, then we can see how it works in the brain. Not exactly sure what they're doing. But in terms of computing, I feel like we can probably improve upon it by using different materials and hardware. It's my thoughts. But again, I'm not an expert on the topic at all. Yeah, what do you think about them?
I don't know, I guess I'm quite curious.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know, it's interesting with neuromorphic computing of like, you know, we call it like, you know, the neuron, the synapse.
Yeah.
I wonder, is there a measure of like how it is to actuality of those things, or do we just call them that?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, like these are abstractions of a neuron, but you could get arbitrarily close if you're willing to spend the time. How you'd measure that is interesting. Honestly, I think you just have to do like a single neuron recording and like kind of compare to it in some way. Maybe you can look at like the activation function, how similar that is to an actual neuron, and just compare how it like relates to stimulus. I'm not sure, but it's actually a really interesting question because I feel like a lot of this field is trending towards like how can we make it a better, more efficient computer. And there is still a subset of it that's looking like how can we actually interface with the brain or do that kind of thing. So that definitely goes up that avenue. So yeah, interesting area for research. Paula, was it? You had a question? Yeah. Sure.
Very complex.
Yes, yes.
So what exactly does, which part does
in the architecture that I just showed you. So the curve will correspond to the diode actually releasing light. So the light, the photons that are emitted essentially are our neurotransmitters, and the action potential being, you know, the electrical potential sort of flowing down through the neuron. That will be kind of the current being transferred from going through the superconducting side across to the diode side. So that's kind of the equivalent. Is that what you mean? Yeah, so the original one that I showed you doesn't. It's just that step function. But some of the more complicated ones, like the one that had in series the different nanowires, that does and can recreate that kind of functionality. Yeah, so they're playing around with it. They just essentially put forward, I didn't put them all in here, but about 10 different sort of versions of neurons. But again, like creativity is your limit, right? You can make anything, just time and effort. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Different contexts. So the thing that kept coming back to was like, where does the idea of subneural computation come into, what we consider neuromorphic computing purposes? Because there are so many computations going on within the cell. I mean, just think about like a dendritic arbor, as an example. We talk about dendrites. A lot of intersections of the dendritic arbor are a computation itself. And you could think of it as a neuron.
Yeah.
But it's like, where exactly do you
Where do you draw the line, right?
Like, what's the computational period? What's the thing?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I guess when you're making it in computers, it's kind of an arbitrary line, right? It's just where you choose to do it and how complicated you want to make it. I don't feel like a lot of groups are really looking at subneuron computation. I personally haven't actually come across it before, so you're already going into new territory for me. But I guess it's another open question, like, do you think there is going to be computational use out of doing that? Will that increase the power? It might, I'm not sure. It all depends on how we're going to attach it to software, I guess, in the end. But I mean, depending on what you actually want to use this for, whether you want the device itself in hardware to be able to run on its own or whether you want to connect it to software. I'm not sure, but it's an interesting question. So there might be people looking into it. You might want to do a Google search on that. I haven't come across it yet, but it seems an interesting question as to whether we can get more power out of an individual circuit. So I think I'll be having a think about that afterwards. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, that's fine. Oh, as in like, can it be in between states? We're kind of going towards the quantum side of things here, are we? As in, so how does it sort of relate to the 0-1 state? Like, as in, how do we encode binary in the neurons? As in the amount that we run through it, or the amount that of light that it produces? Okay, yeah, so the amount that comes out of the diode, is that right? Yeah. I guess when we talk about neuromorphic computing, we actually have to get beyond this idea of like the two states, just the 1 or the 0. It doesn't necessarily use binary computation in that way. So obviously when you get to a normal computer, 1s and 0s are going to tell you the exact output, like that's the whole name of the game. but the information for neuromorphic is not encoded in whether it's a 0 or a 1 state. It's encoded in whether or not it's fired, the intensity of that firing, and then how that relates to the other neurons down the track, and then also the timing of those firings. So there isn't really exactly a 1 or 0 state. I guess you can say, like, at this point, it's fired or not, and that could be your binary. But yeah, it doesn't exactly replicate a 1 or a 0 state. Does that answer your question? You sure? Yeah, cool. Yes?
Well, I noticed that
the interconnects. Yeah. Yes, yes. Actually, you're very good to pick up on that. Yeah, essentially, so what Wilbur is talking about is the fact that across this line, the two sides are different. So in the 1 to 10 version, you can see that it's symmetric. Essentially, we can like fold it into the middle and it looks the same. This was a trick of mine that I used to reduce the computation time. It was taking so long at the very end. We were exploring previously, and I haven't included all of them in these slides. We were looking at whether or not enforcing symmetry over the X or the Y axis, how that actually affects the output, because it's much faster to design these. Like at points, it was taking weeks to actually output these designs when I was running it on the lab computer, which is a big computer. This is not like my laptop that I'm talking about. It's taking weeks to output designs. So essentially we started to put for the really big ones where you've got lots of pixels that it's optimizing. We put the symmetry on. That 1 to 6 one was the final one that I think I did without the symmetry constraint. Essentially that was just put in when I was coding in the inverse design. Yeah, it's an experiment. Like it really seems as though it should be better if you make it symmetric, right? Or that it shouldn't matter, because you're thinking that the light that you put in here should be the same. So it should do the same things if all of these are in the same locations, if that's symmetric. But weirdly enough, it did have a difference. I don't remember off the top of my head now whether the symmetry was better or worse. I think it was actually worse when you enforce the symmetry. And if you just let it optimize on its own, it was better. But yeah, essentially that was just a constraint that I put on the model that was optimizing it. Yeah. This is the thing. Yeah, it's really odd. I think probably it's not actually because the situation physically is not symmetric. I think it's simply how this program actually goes about optimizing. So it uses this technique called I think it's called a gradient descent optimization. So it will generate a random, it has two parts. It has continuous optimization and then it goes discrete. So for a start, you've got, like, just say it's a square, and you can have any pixel value between like 1 and 0, say the refractive indices. And it will create a random combination, and then from that, it'll start to optimize in a continuous way. So you'll have values of the refractive index that are anywhere between 1 and 0, and they may not actually correspond to an actual material, let alone to silicon and to air. So I think that the fact that it's not symmetric is probably an artifact of where it started. So that random combination at the beginning, I wonder, honestly, if you'd have to have that symmetrical. No, that wouldn't make sense. But anyway, I think it comes from the fact that you've got a random thing that you're optimizing. Like it starts off somewhere random, generates it randomly. And this has probably come out of that. The actual thing it started with was not symmetric. And that this is sort of the best that it could do within like the number of iterations that I gave it to optimize. Does that make sense? Cool. Yeah, so I think that's probably where it's come from. But I agree with you that like logically it feels like it should be symmetrical because the physical situation, if this was built correctly, should be symmetric across the x-axis. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, and this actually was a really interesting area of exploration in honours, and I hope someone picks it up as like another honours or maybe a PhD topic. But we were looking at, you can kind of control what it generates for its random group, and we found that it would be so good if I actually had the image to show you guys, but I don't. But essentially, if you modeled like the output based on the initial conditions that it generated, you ended up with like all of these different subgroups of designs, and they actually had different efficiencies. So if you were going to do this for real, not just for like an honours project, but this was a PhD or this was your job, you'd probably want to do hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these simulations and give it really different starting parameters, because you're going to find out that some of them will result in little nodes that are different. So if you imagined like the optimization function as some kind of surface, and you imagine that it's got peaks and then dips, you're looking to optimize generally by minimizing a function. But there's lots of different peaks, right? So depending on where you start, you could end up on a peak that you think is the bottom, but then like just over another little mountain is like the Mariana Trench, right? But you don't know that because you've just done it. So you've got to do it lots of times randomly with different starting conditions. Does that make sense? Cool. Any more questions? No? I think I finally exhausted everybody. Thank you so much for coming and listening to me. It's been really fun to just like talk about my stuff. So I really appreciate it. You guys have been really fun. Thank you. If you have any more questions, please feel free to ask me. And also, if you are looking for an honours or a PhD topic, do consider neuromorphic computing. Very interesting field with a lot of opportunities coming up. So thank you very much.